You already know what the trenches looked like. A gray ditch, mud up to the knee, a boy of 19 with a 1,000-yard stare, waiting for a whistle that will send him over the top to be cut in half by a machine gun because a general 40 miles away wanted to move a flag on a map. He'll be dead by Thursday. Everybody's dead by Thursday. That's the trenches. You know this picture so well you can smell it. And you should. It took a century of extraordinary poetry, brilliant films, and one genuinely perfect sitcom to build it, and most of the people who built it were there. That's what makes this hard. This isn't a myth invented by liars. It's a myth assembled mostly by witnesses. But here's the thing that started this whole video for me. If the trenches were what we think they were, a continuous meat grinder, then the arithmetic doesn't work. The British Army put roughly 4 million men through that war. If the front line killed everyone in it, there would have been nobody left to win anything. And in 1918, that same army won. So either the numbers are lying, or the picture is. It's the picture. And what's underneath it is stranger, more human, and honestly more disturbing than the version you were taught. Because the real horror of the trenches isn't that they were hell, it's what they actually were instead. Let's build the myth properly first, because it deserves respect. The version most of us carry goes roughly like this. In 1914, Europe sleepwalks into a war nobody wants. Millions of young men are fed into a 450-mile ditch running from the North Sea to Switzerland. There they live permanently in freezing water, eating rats, going mad, dying of disease, until an officer with a mustache and a private income blows a whistle and orders them to walk. Walk slowly, in a straight line, into machine guns. They die by the tens of thousands for a few meters of mud, then they do it again. For 4 years, and it achieves precisely nothing. That's the story. Lions led by donkeys, a generation thrown away by idiots. And I want to be very clear about something. You did not get this idea because you're gullible. You got it from the best sources imaginable. You got it from Wilfred Owen, who was actually there and who was actually killed 1 week before the armistice. His mother got the telegram as the church bells were ringing for peace. You got it from Siegfried Sassoon, who was actually there and who threw his military cross into the Mersey. You got it from a generation of memoirists writing in the 1920s and 30s, when the war looked increasingly like it had settled nothing. You got it from Britain's own wartime Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, who spent his memoirs blaming his generals, a man with every political motive to do exactly that. You got it most of all from a sitcom so devastatingly good that it functions for millions of people as a primary source. That's not a hoax, that's testimony. And that's exactly why it's so hard to argue with. So I'm not going to tell you the poets lied. They didn't. I'm going to show you what happens when you take the most horrifying 5% of an experience and let it stand in for the whole thing. And then ask why we, 100 years later, seem to want it that way. Because we do want it that way. Hold that thought. Here's the fact that breaks it. The soldiers weren't in the trenches. I don't mean that as a riddle. I mean it literally. The front line was a rota. The Imperial War Museum puts the average stay in a frontline trench at about 4 days at a time. 4. Then you rotated back to the support line, then the reserve line, then out of the trench system entirely, into a village behind the lines, where you'd be drilled, worked half to death carrying things, and also, crucially, allowed to sleep, wash, drink, play football, and be bored. The Canadian War Museum describes the same cycle, 4 to 6 days at the front, then an equal stretch in the secondary, and reserve trenches, plus periodic leave. The rotation existed precisely because commanders had worked out that leaving men in the front line indefinitely destroyed them, not morally, functionally. Men in permanent frontline exposure stop being soldiers. So the mental image, a man who lives in a trench for 4 years, describes almost nobody. The typical infantryman on the Western Front spent most of his war somewhere else, doing something else, being profoundly uncomfortable in a completely different way. The First World War was, statistically, less about dying and more about carrying heavy objects to a place and then carrying them back. And once you pull that thread, a much weirder one comes with it. There were long stretches where both sides quietly agreed not to kill each other, not the Christmas truce, not one magical football match in 1914. An ongoing, unofficial, day-to-day arrangement running across large parts of the front for large parts of the war. Historians call it live and let live. And the man who documented it, Tony Ashworth, in a 1980 study built from soldiers' diaries, letters, and unit records, found it wasn't rare or shameful. It was a system. Both sides stopped shooting at breakfast. Both sides stopped shooting in heavy rain on the reasonable basis that everyone was already having a bad enough day. Ration parties were let through, repair work was ignored. Snipers who had a clear shot took the shot slightly to the left. Artillery batteries fired on the same coordinates at the same time, daily. So accurately, so predictably, that the shells became a clock, and everyone knew where not to stand. The signal was the ritual. If you fire in a routine, you're announcing you don't mean it. If you fire at breakfast, you're announcing you do. And now nobody eats on either side forever. Ashworth found something that should stop you in your tracks. High command knew, and staff officers looked for it by reading the casualty returns. A quiet sector with too few dead was a sector doing a deal. So they broke it deliberately, with raids, with orders that forced units to produce corpses and prove they'd produce them. Read that again. There were sectors of the Western Front where the killing had to be reimposed from above on men who had stopped. That is not the myth. The myth says the men were sheep and the system was mad. The evidence says the men were negotiating constantly and the system had to work to stop them. Let me show you how that works with two men who never existed. I'm inventing them, and I want you to know I'm inventing them because everything they do is documented. I'm just putting it in one pair of hands. Alfred Sowerby is 24. Before the war, he laid bricks in Leeds. He is now a lance corporal holding 50 yards of trench in a quiet sector in the spring of 1916. 200 yards away, across a strip of churned beetroot field, is Ernst Kohl, who is 26 and used to fix clocks in Hanover. They have never met. They will never meet, and they have an understanding. It works like this. At 7 in the morning, the German battery behind Ernst drops 4 shells on a crossroads a quarter mile behind Alfred, every day. Same time, same crossroads. Alfred's men call it the alarm clock. Nobody has stood at that crossroads at 7 in the morning since February. In return, when the German ration party comes up the communication trench at dusk, and Alfred's sentries can see them, can hear them, could kill 3 of them without trying, nothing happens. Because Alfred's own rations come up 20 minutes later, along a track that is just as visible. This is not kindness. This is a contract. The consideration is dinner. Then, in June, the contract is canceled. Not by Ernst. By a staff officer 30 miles away who has looked at Alfred's battalion's casualty returns for May and drawn the correct conclusion. Nothing is happening here. Orders come down. The battalion will conduct a trench raid. It will take prisoners. It will produce evidence of aggression. So at 2 in the morning, Alfred Sowerby, or Samegi, who has spent 4 months carefully not killing Ernst Kohl, crawls through a gap in the wire with a blackened face and a club, and does his best to kill Ernst Kohl. He doesn't manage it. He brings back 1 terrified 19-year-old and loses 2 men doing it. The report says the raid was a success. The word success is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence. And the next morning at 7, the shells land on the crossroads. Same time, same place. Ernst is telling him something. I know, me too. Nothing personal. We're still on. That's your trench soldier, not a sheep and not a hero. A man running a private foreign policy in 50 yards of ditch, and having it periodically overruled by his own side. Let's put you in it. Not on the worst day, on a normal one. It's 4 in the morning, and you are awake, because everyone is awake. This is stand to. The hour before dawn, when every man in the line stands on the fire step with a rifle. Because dawn is when attacks come. It is the single most reliable fact of your life. Nothing happens. Nothing has happened at Stand To for 11 weeks. You are cold. In a way, you have stopped narrating to yourself. Your feet are the problem. Your feet are always the problem. You have 3 pairs of socks because the army has ordered you to have 3 pairs of socks, and you are under orders to change them twice a day and grease your feet with whale oil, which smells exactly as bad as it sounds, and which your battalion gets through at something like 10 gallons a day. This is not the army fussing. In the first winter of the war, more than 20,000 British soldiers were treated for trench foot, and in December 1914, one division reported that its trench foot casualties outnumbered its battle casualties 3-1. 3-1. Your rotten feet were, briefly, a bigger threat to the British army than the German army. So now a man you barely like inspects your bare feet in the dark, and you inspect his, and if you neglect them, it's a chargeable offense. Somebody in an office worked out that the only way to make men look after their own feet was to make it someone else's job to look at them. Dawn comes, nothing. Stand down. And now the real enemy arrives, and it is not the Germans. It's the next 14 hours. You will fill sandbags. You will pump water out of the trench and watch it come back. You will relay duckboards. You will be handed a tin of macaroni, beef, carrots, turnips, haricot beans, floating in a broth of ambiguous intent. And you will eat it cold, because a fire means smoke, and smoke means shells. One soldier's verdict has outlived the company that made it. Warmed in the tin, it was edible. Cold, it was a man killer. You'll grind army biscuit into powder with your entrenching tool because it is too hard to bite, mix it with jam, and call it pudding. The jam is plum and apple. The jam is always plum and apple. You are eating, by design, about 4,000 calories a day. The 1917 scale aimed at over 4,100. You are being fed like an athlete, and you are still losing weight because you are a laborer with a rifle and the work never stops. And then, at some point in the afternoon, the post arrives. It arrives because in a wooden shed covering 5 acres of Regent's Park in London, reportedly the largest wooden building in the world, staffed overwhelmingly by women, someone has sorted your mother's letter out of 2 billion letters, and it has crossed the channel and found you in a ditch in France in about 2 days. That's the bit that should unsettle you. The same organization that could not think of a way to get you across 400 yards of mud, alive, could get a letter from Aberdeen to your specific hand in under 48 hours. 12 million times a week. You are not in hell. You are in an enormous, damp, efficient bureaucracy that has correctly identified that its main problem is your morale, and is spending an astonishing amount of effort on your socks and your post, while occasionally requiring you to die. That's the horror, not the chaos, the competence. Right. Let's recap the thesis, and then let's prove it properly. The claim is not that the First World War was fine. The claim is that the picture in your head, permanent occupancy, universal death, uniform futility, mindless slaughter, is the least accurate part of a genuinely terrible thing. Here's the evidence. Start with the death rate, because everything else hangs off it. Of the British forces who served, roughly 1 in 8 died. The UK Parliament's own figures give around 880,000 British military deaths, about 12.5% of those serving and about 6% of the adult male population. Appalling. Also, not everyone. Not close to everyone. But averages hide things, so here's a better number. In 2023, 3 economists, Roy Bailey, Timothy Hatton, and Chris Inwood, published a study in Economics and Human Biology, tracking 2,400 individual non-officer British servicemen born in the 1890s, real men, real records, followed through the whole war. Among that sample, 13.1% were killed in action, and another 23.5% were wounded. And then they isolated the worst case, a man who joined the infantry at the very start and stayed in the army to the end. The unluckiest profile in the entire war. For him, the probability of being killed in action came out at 29%, and the probability of being killed or wounded at 64%. Sit with that, even for the most exposed group. Infantry from 1914, all the way through, roughly 7 in 10 came home alive. The myth says everyone died. The men who were actually most likely to die had a survival rate of about 70%. That's not a consolation. 29% is a catastrophe. It's just not the catastrophe you were told about. And the difference matters. Because the myth of universal death is what lets us file the whole thing as a natural disaster, rather than a series of decisions. Second, the trenches saved lives. This is the sentence people refuse to hear, so let me hand it to someone with more authority than me. Sir Hugh Strachan, one of the most respected historians of the conflict, writes in his book The First World War, "Trenches created health problems, but they saved lives. To speak of the horror of the trenches is to substitute hyperbole for common sense. The war would have been far more horrific if there had been no trenches. They protected flesh and blood from the worst effects of the firepower revolution of the late 19th century." The logic is brutal and simple. By 1914, industry had produced quick-firing artillery and machine guns, and had produced no way to move men safely toward them. That gap is the war. The trench is not the cause of the slaughter. The trench is the response to it. The open field battles of 1914, before everyone dug in, were proportionally some of the most murderous of the entire war. The killing happened when men left the trench. The trench was the safest place on the battlefield. It's just that it was the safest place on the battlefield, which tells you what the battlefield was. Third, for the first time in the history of organized war, the fighting killed more men than the germs did. This is genuinely one of the great hinge points in human history, and almost nobody knows it. In every major war before this one, the Crimea, the American Civil War, the Boer War, disease was the champion. In the Crimean War, roughly 34,000 of the combatants studied were killed in action, while some 130,000 died of disease. In Britain's war in South Africa, more men were killed by typhoid alone than by the enemy. Then the First World War inverts it. British and Dominion deaths from disease came to around 113,000, against roughly 418,000 killed in action and 167,000 dead of wounds. Sanitation, inoculation, clean water, organized evacuation. The mud that we remember as the symbol of squalor sat on top of the most successfully deloused, inoculated, medically administrated army that had ever gone to war. The trenches were disgusting. They were also, medically speaking, a triumph. Both of those are true, and history does not care that you find that annoying. Fourth, and this is the one I found hardest, shot at dawn, the image of firing squads mowing down terrified boys for cowardice. That happened, and it is a genuine stain. But the scale isn't what we think, and the machinery wasn't either. The figures were laid out in the House of Commons in 1998. Between August 1914 and March 1920, around 20,000 personnel were convicted of offenses under the British Army Act that could have carried the death penalty. Just over 3,000 were actually sentenced to death, and roughly 90% of those sentences were commuted by the chain of command. The number actually executed for a military offense, some 306. 306 men shot by their own side is 306 too many, and in 2006 they were pardoned, rightly, because we now understand that a lot of what was called cowardice was untreated trauma. But 9 out of 10 death sentences were overturned by the same generals we've cast as bloodthirsty. That is not a rubber stamp. That is a system agonizing, imperfectly, inconsistently, and with terrible consequences for the unlucky 306 over whether to kill its own men. The myth wants monsters. The record shows something worse. Ordinary men, with ordinary hesitancy, administering an atrocity part-time. And fifth, because I promised you rigor, not a defense brief. The first day of the Somme was as bad as you've heard. July 1st, 1916, around 57,470 British casualties in a single day, more than 19,000 of them dead. The worst day in the history of the British Army, and no amount of context softens it. But even here, the famous detail is shakier than the story. The image of men ordered everywhere to walk slowly in neat lines is contested. The Fourth Army's tactical notes issued under Rawlinson used loose phrases: a steady pace, the rapid advance of some lightly equipped men, and appear to have left the method to battalion commanders. Different divisions did different things. Some units crept out into no man's land before the barrage lifted. And a man carrying 60-plus pounds of kit across broken ground was going to be walking regardless of what anybody ordered. I want to be careful here, because historians genuinely disagree about this, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise to make my argument tidier. Plenty of primary accounts do describe an advance at a slow walk, as ordered. The War Diary of the 1st Battalion Border Regiment says exactly that, and so both things are in the record. The truth is messier than either version, and messier is the point. Because uniform stupidity is a story. Actual command in 1916, improvising at a scale nobody had ever attempted, with communications that ended at the end of a telephone wire, is not a story. It's a mess. And a mess is much harder to be angry at. So let's ask the real question, not why the myth started, why we keep it. Because we've had the corrective for decades. Gary Sheffield published Forgotten Victory in 2001, arguing that the war was tragic but not futile, and that the British citizen army went through a bloody learning curve and emerged by 1918 capable of winning the greatest run of victories in its history. Revisionist historians have been making this case for over 30 years. Professor David Reynolds called Sheffield's the most significant of those works, and it has barely dented the public picture. At all. Sheffield's colleagues have watched this happen and noted the obvious. The futility narrative has been rebutted over and over again, and it displays remarkable longevity. That's not an accident of education, that's a preference. So here's my reframe, and you're entitled to disagree with it. We keep the myth because the myth is comfortable. Think about what mindless slaughter actually does for us. If the men were sheep, they weren't complicit, right? And neither is anyone else. If the generals were idiots, the problem was stupidity, and stupidity is fixable, and we're cleverer now. If the whole thing was futile, then nobody has to do the hard work of deciding whether it was worth it, which means nobody has to look at the men who did the deciding and see people with faces like ours. The myth of the trenches is an anesthetic. It converts a political catastrophe, made by identifiable people over years with reasons, into a natural disaster, a tragedy nobody chose. And that's soothing because you can't be implicated in weather. The truth is worse. The truth is that a modern, literate, humane, well-organized society, a society that inoculated its soldiers, inspected their feet, and moved 12 million letters a week to keep them from despair, looked at all of that and kept sending them over the top. Not because it was stupid, because it had decided the price was worth paying, and because the men doing the paying were mostly someone else's sons. That's not a story about donkeys. That's a story about how a functioning society decides what a life is worth, and then keeps functioning. And that machinery has not been dismantled. It's just been upgraded. Every time you see a war reported as a quagmire, a tragedy, a thing that somehow happened, notice who that framing protects. Notice that nobody has to have decided anything. Notice that it sounds a lot like the trenches. I want to end with Alfred and Ernst because I think they've been done a disservice. The myth gives them our pity, which is generous, and takes away their minds, which isn't. It says, poor lambs, they had no idea, but they did. They knew exactly where they were. That's why they built the whole quiet architecture of not killing. The breakfast truce, the alarm clock shelling, the shot deliberately taken wide. Those weren't the reflexes of the doomed. They were the decisions of people who had worked out the rules of an insane place and were doing their level best to survive it, together, across the wire. with a man they'd been told was a monster and had correctly identified as a bloke who also wanted his dinner. That's not a lion led by a donkey. That's a clockmender from Hanover and a bricklayer from Leeds, running the most sophisticated diplomatic arrangement either of them would ever be part of. Out of a hole in the ground in the rain, without ever speaking. They deserve better than our pity. They deserve our attention. So the next time someone tells you the trenches were mindless slaughter, you don't have to argue. Just ask them what the men were doing for the other 20 hours of the day. It's a better question than it sounds. It has an answer. And the answer is the whole war. Thanks for staying to the end of this one. It was a difficult one to make.